8th G20 Summit, which was recently concluded in St. Petersburg in Russia. The summit came at a time when there are clear divisions between emerging economies and the US over the Federal Reserve's winding down of stimulus and a slowdown of the Indian economy as well as those of other emerging economies. And to discuss the outcome of the G20 Summit, we are joined in our studios by two distinguished guests. Please welcome Dr. Ramupendra Das, who is a Senior Fellow in the Research and Information Systems of the Ministry of External Affairs. Welcome to Insight, Dr. Das. And we are also joined by Dr. Wael Awad, who is a Senior Journalist. Welcome to Insight, Dr. Awad. And later in the program, we will be joined by Dr. Amirullah Khan, who is a noted economist. Dr. Das, I'd like to begin with you. You know, we understand the G20 Summit, the G20 grouping, it came together after the 2008 crisis. But what is the role that this grouping has played in the world economy?
You know, obviously the immediate response of the countries of the world was to the 2008 financial crisis.
Right.
Not that the issues of coordination and global governance were not looked at earlier prior to 2008, but the immediate trigger was 2008. And therefore, if you ask me one single thing which is the mainstay of G20 leaders is global governance.
All right. Now,
global governance can range from financial institutions, international financial infrastructure that we have, to climate change negotiations.
Right.
Alongside this, the mandate also has included the restructuring of the Bretton Woods institutions like World Bank and IMF, prudential norms for banking systems, the Basel III norms and its implementation. There was a Financial Stability Board that was constituted, precisely for the surveillance of the financial institutions, including banking supervision. Then there have been issues like corruption, money laundering, tax evasion, and issues of tax havens. So if you put all these together, and we will come to the St. Petersburg summit agenda in a while,
right.
I would see this as a pointer to two things. One is that the countries of the world have realized that you cannot leave global economic governance to some institutions. It is very important to have a regular summit, and therefore I would say that the very fact that the crisis was used as an opportunity to do this is one of the major gains, I would say. But yes, the road is long which has to be traveled. Second important thing is inclusion of India into the global discourse as far as economic matters are concerned. Earlier it used to be always G8 which used to call the shots as far as determining the global course of economic dynamism or lack of it. And now with India's inclusion along with other emerging economies in the broad decision making process of G20 is the second thing from our national point of view that I would like to highlight. So I think these are the two things at this stage I would like to mention.
Okay, so you're saying there were, of course, key takeaways for India as well from this G20 summit. We'll discuss those as well, and whether or not it has been able to restore that
crisis that have been forced itself on the agenda as a top priority, and that makes sure that tell us also the amount of pressures and tension in the new international order rather than really the Syrian crisis, because here you have an international community trying to sustain the economic growth in the world, trying to stabilize it and trying to ensure that there is an e-governing body that it can ensure the sustainability and the growth, whether it is India, whether it is China, which is leading the world economy for this decade. So therefore, to have a kind of a order. So Syria forced itself on the agenda, not because of the American and Russian difference in the issue, but it has shown to a large extent that the instability in the Middle East will have a great impact, especially in the oil prices.
Absolutely.
Despite the fact that maybe people think that Russia is gaining from a short term gaining on this, but here it is. It's not that China, it's sticking to the principle of sustainability and a growth that should be remain in the world in a manner that you should not, you should have a more a vision of how to lead the world as a emerging superpower, or as a superpower, Russia on its own, along with the American and the other superpower in the region. So therefore, I think Syria has forced itself definitely on the agenda, and we expected, and the outcome was very much shown the differences between those who try to sell a war and those who are defending the international order.
Right, and it did expose the deep divisions that exist between Russia and the US on this issue. But as you said, this is something that is bound to have implications not just for the region but for the world economy as well. It will push up oil prices for sure. Dr. Das, you know, this was also part of the action plan that had come out at the end of the summit. The G20 nations, you know, stressed upon avoiding policies that could cause global recovery to falter, and any such strike or any such development
on the economic recovery, especially when most of the countries are grappling with you know, tapering off of growth, you know, and other you know, domestic issues. I think it was another positive outcome of the G20 summit, where non-economic issues and their linkages with the economic trajectories of the global economic trajectories were taken cognizance of, and therefore I would definitely consider this to be a highlight which is often not looked at, because usually G20 you know, hawks limelight in terms of international financial system and related issues. But this is, in this summit, you know, I would definitely consider this to be an important dimension where the linkages between non-economic and economic was actually taken note of.
Absolutely. In fact, in the whole run-up to the G20 summit, we saw how, you know, it was supposed to be about the world economy, but it was overshadowed by deep divisions that existed among the G20 members on how to respond to the developments in Syria. But speaking about India now, what do you think would be the key takeaways for us?
If you see Indian intervention during the summit, you would realize that number one, our Prime Minister demanded from the developed world, especially the US, that any tapering of the fiscal stimulus that they are envisaging, we should have clarity, and it should be done with certain degree of transparency. So that there is some advanced signals already sent to some of the emerging economies because of the stimulus. You know, the capital had flowed into emerging economies, and just the reverse of that also was creating the reversal of capital inflows. And therefore, because of this interdependence between developed world's fiscal to any unfolding situation. Yes, we are aware that the imperatives of the developed nations in terms of handling their monetary policy would be determined by their domestic you know, issues and concerns. But at the same time, it was very important to highlight that it has wider international implications, and that has at least come out in the G20 you know, declaration that yes, you have some you know, very advanced signals that by the end of the year the US Fed would like to taper off, but they are going to meet this month.
Right. Dr. Das, you know, we'll discuss in greater detail what the US this whole winding down of fiscal stimulus is all about, and how an advance notice can actually help economies such as India to prepare for withdrawal of funds when we return from this short break. Stay with us. Discussing the outcome of the recently concluded G20 summit. Joined by Dr. Amirullah Khan, who's a noted economist. Welcome to Insight, Dr. Khan. We were discussing the relevance of the G20 grouping, and we know how it had achieved unprecedented cooperation between the developed world and the emerging economies to stave off the 2009 economic crisis. Do you think it has been able to address the concerns of emerging economies this time around too?
I think that's been the biggest takeaway from the Russian meet. In that it was clear that almost everybody who was attending was conscious of the fact that there is a problem. That in itself was the big achievement. That it agreed that any measure